Welcome to Yoga Teachers Masterclass. I'm Paula Mitten, and today I'm speaking with Stephanie Snyder. Stephanie is the founder of Love Story in San Francisco. She leads workshops, retreats, and teacher trainings all over the world, as well as classes online on glow.com. And I'm delighted to get to speak to Stephanie today. So Stephanie, thank you so much for joining us.
Hello, so glad to be here.
Will you start just by telling us a little bit about yourself and the style of yoga that you offer?
Oh, sure. So I've been teaching for a couple of decades, and I teach vinyasa yoga. Although that's primary. That's 90% of what I teach. I also online, I have prenatal and postnatal yoga, which I love to support the mamas. And I also teach some somatic movement and yoga for recovery too.
Very good. And I saw that you kind of specialize in philosophy and yogic texts, and I was wondering, you know, for teachers who would like to start to introduce that into their classes, is that something that you weave together, the asana practice and the philosophy?
Absolutely. You will never have class with me that does not include philosophy. In fact, you know, it took a while for me to integrate that, though, because you have to have a clear and sort of mature understanding. And I still have a long way to go, but before you can really transmit that information in a way that feels accessible to other people, I think. And so I always integrate the philosophy, and I try to just weave it in a way that is sort of digestible and relevant. And I always suggest to teachers that if they're interested in incorporating philosophy in class, which I highly recommend, first, you have to apply the philosophy to your own life. You have to have experienced actual psychic change through rigorous application of the philosophy. And only then, really, I think, is it appropriate to offer the philosophy to students. Because what you don't want to do is just sort of repeat something that you read in a book. Which isn't a bad thing. It's not going to hurt anybody, but it's not really going to land with the weight that you want. So, and you don't want to be, you know, teaching one platitude after the other either. You know what I mean? So if it's coming from a real place, from direct personal experience, then I think that's sort of the best way to teach anything, right?
Right, yeah. And how, like, can you give us an example of how, you know, what you would introduce? Is it sutras, or is it from any of the texts, or what way do you bring it in?
So I teach a lot of philosophy workshops, and I teach a lot of philosophy in my yoga teacher training. And so that is much more in depth. But in a regular public vinyasa class, I usually stick to the Yoga Sutras by Patanjali and the Bhagavad Gita. These two texts are extremely relevant, especially the Gita, for people who live, you know, not necessarily in an ashram, but in the world, and they have relationships and jobs and issues. And so, and you know, the Gita is so full of teachings. I could teach exclusively from the Gita for the rest of my life and never run out of really good, juicy content. So usually it's one of those, or, you know, sometimes, you know, I'll introduce some sort of the Vedanta in a way, though, that's more, you know, very down to earth. I try to keep the teaching of the philosophy very grounded.
Right, because of course, a lot of students that come to practice may not have ever come across any of that before. So it needs to be...
Exactly. You know,
sorry, go ahead.
That's right. I try not to too much, you know, if I'm using Sanskrit, which I do, I also include the English. And the truth is, though, you know, the way I look at the philosophy is it is ancient, it is sacred, it is all of those things, but it really is not complicated, actually. It's quite accessible. And so I don't think there's much of it that I wouldn't introduce in a public class. It's just more of how and why.
Right. And so then your main style of teaching is vinyasa. So can you talk to us about the importance of starting to expand on, rather than just calling out the poses, because I think when we start teaching first, we get into the habit of calling out the names of the poses and just leading people from one pose to the next. But how do we then move into a place where we're teaching, we're passing on our knowledge, or educating our students, and maybe empowering our students to explore in the practice?
Well, I think, you know, I'm also an alignment junkie and an anatomy junkie, and actually most of my teachers are Iyengar teachers, so most of my training and background is in that. So I bring a lot of that with me in the instruction of the poses and vinyasa. But I also really encourage people to, you know, I don't want to induce an experience for someone. I think that would be sort of abusing my position. What I want is to try to introduce, you know, either it's a philosophical concept, or it's a pose, or it's the sequence and how the sequence is working, and then ask students to observe their own experience in that moment, and to also hold themselves accountable. Is this working or is it not? And I also do give students a lot of, not too many, but a lot of options. Another thing I've started to do over time, because vinyasa tends to attract the type A personality, right? The doer, the person who really wants to work hard and probably works too hard, is I really try to infuse classes with this spirit of, you know, do some poses and really watch what's happening with the mind, and see yourself in the moment, and how you do this here is how you do everything everywhere. And let go of the pusher, and let go of the inner critic, and notice when that starts to come in. And so I try, even though my classes are challenging, to keep the spirit of the practice very generous. And, you know, maybe you're binding today and maybe you're not. What's the big deal, right? It's more about how are you in this moment, not what does it look like, you know?
Right. And so with the alignment, because I think that's important, and then obviously a lot of students will feel things differently and will have different things going on. So is that where you bring in the options to allow them to find the best place in the pose for them, or what other techniques do you use, props or other ways of getting them to?
Sure. I always offer props and as an option, and, you know, sometimes I'll just go and give someone a prop whether they want it or not, because I, you know, think that it would be better for them, and I don't get into a discussion about it. I just walk over, put their hand on the prop, and then I leave. And then, you know, after that, like, I've done my job, and if they're gonna not use the prop, that's up to them. But giving the option of props, giving the option of, you know, what I do when I teach, especially the advanced classes, is I will start with the sort of foundation of the pose, and then add and say, stay there or try this, stay there or try this. And then I'll always say, if you tried that and it's not working out, go back. You know, if there's a dramatic conversation happening in your head about this pose, go back. And giving people lots of permission just to be in the moment in a way that is honest, in a way that is friendly to their body, and in a way that is really loving. You know, yoga is not about contortion. And so whether you get your legs behind your head, which I don't recommend, by the way, whether you ever get your legs behind your head or not, that really has very little to do with how happy you're going to be and how much yoga is going to be able to change your life.
Yeah, I love that. Because we can kind of get caught up, right, in the picture or the pose that we've seen on Instagram or whatever it is, and that's only maybe a side effect of practicing for a very long time, but not really the benefit that we're looking for, or the real purpose for being on the mat.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I emphasize a lot is the point of the physical practice is so that we can sit in meditation for a longer period of time without the distraction of discomfort. Mm-hmm. And that really, meditation is where it's at. And so do some poses, you know, do a few poses, keep the body strong and fit so that you can meditate, so that you can be of service in the world, and so that you are taking responsibility for your own health and well-being and not a burden to others, if you can help it. Mm-hmm. And, you know, that's kind of the purpose of the poses, really.
Yes. Yeah. And talk to us about safety within the vinyasa practice, because you know, obviously when we're teaching or we're practicing vinyasa, it's maybe a little bit faster or more easier to pick up injuries or to go into misalignment and things like that. How do you introduce, what kind of techniques or things do you introduce in your teaching that keeps your students safe while still moving through a flow and enjoying the fun side of the vinyasa?
Right. So one thing is giving pretty detailed cueing. The other thing we do in vinyasa is repeat the poses a lot. So, you know, every time we're in Urdhva Mukha Svanasana, upward facing dog, I'll give a different cue. You know, so over the span of a class, I've given them lots of information on that one pose. I don't give them every cue the first time and not again. I just continue to sort of layer the information. Also, definitely walking around the room, giving physical assists or props when necessary. I always have assistants in the room in my classes too, to help with that. But, you know, I think really good sequencing, strategic sequencing, based on alignment and anatomy is very important and can go a long way. And what I try to do is, if there's a peak pose, there's always a peak pose in my class. And then I'll also layer other ways of sequencing on. But, you know, I've taught, by the time we get to the peak pose, I've taught every other part of that pose through the sequence. And then it comes together. And I don't even have to tell the students that's what's happening. But by the time I ask them to get into a more difficult pose, they've experienced all the different aspects of that pose one way or another. And then maybe it comes together and maybe it doesn't. But I always give them an option. And like I said, I build from, you know, easier to harder so that they can stop when it's time for them to stop and not push themselves. And so I think sequencing is a huge, huge part of it. I also think when the room gets a little aggro, you know, when it's going too fast, or I see people's eyes getting hard, they're pushing.
Yeah.
I take it down, you know, I take it down. And that's my job as a teacher, is to pull back when we need to pull back and soften. And, you know, as a teacher, you have a command, and you have that choice, and you need to make good choices as a teacher.
Yeah, and so obviously that comes in, it links to, you have your plan of what you want to teach, but you can't always guarantee that you can follow through with that plan, right? You're guided by how people are in front of you and how they are as they move through the practice.
Absolutely. You know, in trainings, we spend a lot of time on sequencing, because I really think, you know, a sequence makes a difference between a student leaving feeling fantastic or feeling tweaked or feeling agitated energetically or feeling calm. You know, there's also all the energetics of sequencing. So being able to be flexible. And I think if you have really good understanding of why you're putting a pose where you're putting a pose, you know, that's the other thing I teach, is that if you show me your sequence, I should be able to point to any pose in that sequence. You're going to tell me exactly why that pose is in that place in that moment. And so if you have that kind of understanding about sequencing and you're not just throwing poses together, then you know how in the moment to riff off of your original plan in a way that still makes sense, but is teaching to the people that are actually in front of you. So you're there to serve the student. The student is never there to serve your brilliant sequence, you know? Yes. And that's what I find that a very creative, fun thing to do, is to have some kind of an idea of what you're going to do, and then customize it, you know, for the people that are in front of you. That's very stimulating to me. I love that.
Yes, yeah, I agree 100%. I think sequencing is huge, and there's a big difference, isn't there, between taking a class where the sequence just isn't right and you come out feeling like you need another yoga class compared to a class where it really builds like that, one pose building on the next to prepare you for where you're going and to bring you back down the other side as well. That's something else that I think sometimes gets missed, right? Can you talk to us about, after you've hit the peak pose, what you're doing on the other side?
Yes. So, you know, building the sequence so they have the best possible chance of hitting the peak pose. And if they don't, it's no big deal, right? And there are options. Yeah. So the way I look at the cool down or the unwind is how do we let the peak pose slowly leave the body? I'm, mm-hmm. I'm not a fan of intense counter poses.
Mm.
I think that's really hard on the body. There's a lot of wear and tear that comes with that. And so, how do we let the shape of the peak pose just slowly, phase by phase, leave the body until not only have you balanced the nervous system energetically, depending on what, how demanding the peak pose was, but also physically you have unwound the body in a way that is very systematic and not too extreme. I think that's a really big part of the unwind and the cool down. Yeah.
Can you give us an example of an extreme counter pose, like two poses that would be quite extreme? Because I know there's a lot of that. It happens, yeah. Right? And it doesn't feel good.
Okay, so I really don't like if you're doing Urdhva Dhanurasana straight into a forward fold.
Yeah.
Or fold into Urdhva Dhanurasana. That's too much. The Paschimottanasana, it's too extreme on the spine. And the other thing we have to remember is, who are you teaching? You're teaching, here, at least in the States, and I'm sure in Ireland too, most of the places I teach, people who work, they're sitting a lot. They're not moving. They're not doing these poses, necessarily every single day. And so I have to take that into consideration. If it's someone who's been practicing Ashtanga every single day for 20 years, that is a different body. But that's not mostly who I'm teaching. And so I need to consider who is before me, and not only, you don't always know, but not only what am I seeing, but also what do I know about their lifestyle, and people who are in the cities and running around and busy, and so considering that as well. I also think it's important to consider the time of day. Your body's much different in the morning than it is late at night, not only physically but energetically. The person who comes to a noon weekday class is generally a different person than comes to the 6 p.m. See what I'm saying? Like energetically, that person is different. And so I want to also incorporate that, any insight that I have, into the sequence and the way that I'm teaching the class.
Yeah, that's actually a really great point, because I think sometimes as teachers, we might not take that into consideration, right? We have the plan that we're teaching our beginners or our mixed level, and it's the same for all the different time slots.
No, it's not only that, it's the time, the neighborhood you're in, the level, the time of year. Is it hot out? Is it cold out? Is there something globally going on that's been very stressful? There's so much to consider. And I think considering everything that you possibly can is what helps guide you as a teacher, and offer something that's really relevant and loving to the people that are there. So each class has its own personality.
Yeah.
And different studios have personality too. And so knowing that and getting familiar with that is going to be really helpful, for any teacher.
Absolutely. And as a student, it makes all the difference as to how you feel when you walk out of the class and you feel that amazing feeling. You don't know what it is. You don't know why you feel so good after one teacher's class as opposed to a different teacher's class. But that's what it is, isn't it? It's putting together perfectly the poses and the right energy and the right pace and all of that.
Yeah, considering every part of it, and considering, someone who comes to a 7 a.m. hour-long class, they're prioritizing this. They're squeezing it in before work. They need to get out on time. Don't stress them out by going over, because they probably have to go to work. You need to know these things. You need to know that they don't want to leave sedated. They want to leave clear so that they can go out into their day. Whereas an 8 p.m. class, I'm going to make sure that I've really, really brought them back down if I did backbend, so that they can go to sleep. Because it's late, it's nighttime, These are all things to consider. And I think, part of the process of really maturing as a teacher too. And
Sorry, I missed the end of your sentence. A pause there. You said maturing as a student.
Yes, and considering all of these things, and that it's not just about a peak pose.
Yeah.
So I think a lot of people get stuck on that.
Yes, yeah. You mentioned that you dive deep into anatomy. Talk to us about the importance of learning and relearning your anatomy and exploring the body as a teacher.
Okay, so for me, the way that I teach, and I know everybody's different, and I think you should teach to your strength and what you love to teach. So Just speaking for myself, I'm an anatomy nerd. I love it. I'm very fascinated by the human body. However, when I teach, I have the knowledge, and so I incorporate that knowledge mostly through alignment cueing and sequencing. Mm-hmm. I don't teach anatomy. I don't use anatomical terms in class. Half the people don't know what that is. Mm-hmm. What you're talking about is not going to help anybody. I also try not to get, unless I'm in a training or something, I try not to get into too much anatomical information, because I don't really want you in your head in that way, because it really tends, I think, to encourage doing it, what's right versus what's wrong. And the more you know about anatomy, the more you realize that actually doesn't even exist. I mean, there are some big rules, to follow, but really every body is very, very different. And that's why I'll never give the same adjustment to anyone either. I don't have a Trikonasana adjustment. I have this assist that I'm doing for you in this pose because it's relevant for you in this pose. And I think that the anatomy is the same way. Everyone's anatomy is a little bit different. And so I bring that knowledge into the room, but I don't teach in a regular class very anatomical instruction. Mm-hmm. It's not my thing either. I'm more interested in transmitting the philosophy. How are you going to go home and improve your relationship with your kid is more important to me than the fact that, the head of the femur fits into the acetabulum. But again, that's just me, that's just me.
Yeah. But I mean, it's important to, it feeds your teaching in terms of what you're asking people to do. And how you're putting your sequences together and how you're working, and even how you're going in and doing your hands-on assists. It's all relevant to your teaching. It's just you don't overwhelm your students with the words and the names, and they don't need to know probably really that information.
Well, if they do, then they probably are, they might go to a different teacher, which I think is great too. Maybe they go to me and some other teacher that's super into teaching the anatomy. I'm fine with that. That's just not my priority. But I do think teachers must know the anatomy. And I think, most teachers are not. So it's not overt, but it absolutely, the anatomy and the anatomical information informs my teaching for sure. The way that you said, exactly.
Yeah. So it's something that I know on our 200-hour training, for example, you only get so much information. So it's something that you've got to keep learning. You've got to keep going back and rereading and studying. And there's always new research coming out. There's always new information coming out, right? Absolutely.
And, the other thing that I learned a long time ago is I started in Ashtanga yoga, actually. And then I started moving toward Iyengar. But the funny thing was, over the years, these are master teachers, right? Patabi Joyce and Mr. Iyengar. I mean, God bless both their souls. They were masters. And so it would be like, this is Trikonasana in Ashtanga. This is the stance. Iyengar, this is the stance, or this is the stance. But over time, they changed their minds a little bit. They adjusted the alignment a little bit. So we have to remember that too, and that's when I thought, as you learn and grow as a teacher, your understanding learns and grows, and you're going to share that with the students. And so to be careful of sort of becoming rigid in your ideas of alignment and anatomy, because new information comes through science and research. And also, you learn more from working in your own body and from working with more and more students over time. So there's got to be some sort of, you can't just learn, this is the shape, and everybody should be in this shape, and then that's it, and you never dive into it again. It's definitely something that should be part of your continuing education, and I think that teachers should hold themselves accountable in that way. And in our 200-hour training, Bex Urban does it, and she's done cadaver studies. She actually prepares the bodies in cadaver anatomy studies. And so she has opened my eyes to a lot of this, that no IT band looks the same, guys. There's a difference between a body who's a runner and a body who's, never run at all. And it's all about the connective tissue. And so I think also studying from someone like that, who's been in bodies, many, many, many actual bodies, it really makes a difference because you cannot learn that stuff out of a book.
No.
And so we're fortunate to have her for sure. And being able to really experience, where is the psoas in your body? Touch your own psoas, what is that doing, et cetera. Having a real living, dynamic relationship with anatomy, I think is really important.
Yes, and that idea that we you're talking about our teaching has to change over time, and not to get so rigid in the way things are done is so important. Like I'd hate to be still teaching the same way that I was when I started first. I mean, because I've learned so much in that time, so it is really important, isn't it?
Absolutely. And I think students should expect that.
Yeah.
I really think students should look for a teacher who's always continuing education. And for me, the only reason I'm a decent teacher is because I am a great student. I am obsessed with yoga. I am always taking classes. I'm always studying with my teacher. I'm always, because it's just, it's one of the most generous practices ever. So there's never, I'll never be done. And so I think it's important for students to look for a teacher who has that kind of passion about the practice and commitment as a student. So the most important thing for any teacher is to be a great student, and that will get you where you want to go.
Yes, brilliant. Thank you so much. Before we finish up, can you tell everybody where they can find more information on your trainings and your retreats and workshops?
Sure. So my website is stephaniesnyder.com. So that's pretty easy. And I travel all over the world and teach. Most of the teacher trainings I do are in San Francisco, which is a terrible place to visit. So people really don't like coming here.
Oh, really? I was like, really? I thought it would be great.
Not only do you get to do teacher training, but you get to be in San Francisco, which is one of the best cities in the world. So that's at Love Story Yoga, and that's lovestoryyoga.com. And so we have trainings, workshops, everything is there also. And I encourage people to come and visit. We have lots of people from Europe and Ireland who come, people from Asia who come for our teacher trainings. And then Yoga Glow also, it's actually glow.com, GLO.com. And I have hundreds of classes there. And I also have some philosophy courses there. So I have courses on yama and niyama, on the kleshas that you can do at home. And that was really important to me to help support teachers also, because I know it's hard for teachers to travel if they're home working, and you got to be with your students. So online learning is really valuable too.
Amazing. Thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thanks to everybody for watching today. I'll be back again tomorrow with our next expert. Namaste.